Today we're going to be looking at mixed-use development, which is one of the most exciting areas of modern hospitality and real estate. Now, my name is George Sell. I'm Editor-in-Chief at International Hospitality Media, and we are a publisher of online B2B websites for the hospitality industry and an organizer of awards and events. Now, this Urban Living webinar series is sponsored by Flywire, who are a global payments company, and we're just going to watch a quick video so we can find out a bit more about them.
Nemo Bay is a wilderness resort remotely located in the southern part of the Great Bear Rainforest, which is just off the northern tip of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And people that come to Nemo Bay are usually looking for adventure, wilderness, for wildlife. Oftentimes guests leave in tears just feeling so moved by the place. What really appealed to us about Flywire originally was just their ease and payments for credit cards, because at the time our credit card payment was not easy by any stretch. People would have to go to the bank to do a bank wire transfer, or they'd have to call us with their credit card information. We'd have to write it down. There's a lot of room for error. And if someone had a trouble with a bank wire, we'd have to try to resolve it on our own. If not, we'd have to call the bank. It was just very complicated. There was nothing easy about our payment system. One of the great things about Flywire is it will automatically convert into their currency if they wish, and they have the option of paying by credit card or by wire transfer, and it's just a click right from their living room, right from their computer, right from their phone. So it's just made the payment process so much simpler and easier for them. I've been totally blown away with how much it really transformed our payment system for both our side of things as well as our guest side of things. Within our work week, we save about 25% of our time not having to worry about payments. It really allows us to focus on our customer care and really giving us the space and time to really focus on our guest experience. I can't say enough good things about Flywire and how it's transformed our business. We've saved money with Flywire, and just working with the Flywire team has been an absolute delight.
Okay, so thanks to Flywire for sponsoring. If you'd like to find out more about them and get in touch, you can see the contact details in the chat. So this webinar is going to last around an hour. We're going to have 45 minutes or so of panel discussion, and then we'll get around to some Q&A at the end. So we encourage you to submit any questions you might have for our speakers using the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. Everybody who is registered will receive a link to a recording in the next few days. So before I introduce you to our panelists, I just wanted to run through a couple of context slides to frame today's discussion. And the first three are all from a paper by a guy called Stephen Ferrandi of KLNB Commercial Real Estate in the US. Now it's a few years old now, so it's a good starting point for our discussion, because I think some things may have changed since this was published, but it's quite interesting. So he asserts that mixed-use development needs a minimum of 3 revenue-producing uses, and examples of those are the ones that you can see on your screen there. So office, hotel, retail, parking, residential, manufacturing, entertainment, community and cultural, and religious. He also says mixed-use development must exhibit the following attributes: be a development project in conformance with a coherent plan. Mixed-use components should be significant, for example, more than site-serving convenience facilities, and they should be pedestrian-friendly. And lastly, he warns that mixed-use projects experience the greatest economic trouble when one of the components is developed at a scale, quality, or cost level that requires other components to subsidize it. That's something that we'll definitely move on and discuss later in the session. And finally, I just wanted to show this example. This is a story that we've run on our service department news website this week. And it struck me that it's a really good example of what's happening right now. So this is a big redevelopment of a site in Leeds city centre that's just gained planning consent. And they've pretty much thrown the kitchen sink at it. So it includes elements of build to rent, student accommodation, an apart hotel, co-working space, office, retail and leisure. So it's a really significant scheme, and we're seeing more and more examples like this. Also significant, I think, is the fact that more than half of the site is to remain landscaped with what they're describing as engaging public realm installations, with a significant landscape public square being the focus point of the scheme. So this idea of mixed-use developments being accessible to and used by the general public and not just the tenants, I think is an interesting one. So we've got a great panel today. I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves one by one, and then we'll get on with the discussion. Yolande, would you like to introduce yourself first, please?
Pleasure. I'm Yolande Barnes, Professor of Real Estate at UCL and Chair of the Bartlett Real Estate Institute.
Thanks, Yolande. And Harry, good afternoon to you.
Hi, afternoon, George. Hi, everybody else. My name is Harry Harris. I'm Managing Director of SUSD. We're a small development and design company in central London. And we do our own developments, but we also provide consultancy services for other developers and investors.
Thanks, Harry. And now over to festive Geoff. Good afternoon to you.
Apologies for the Christmas jumper. It's our Christmas jumper day today. I'm Geoff Hull from EPR Architects. I'm one of the board directors with Pascal, and Pascal can introduce himself as well. I'm predominantly working within the hospitality sector. We as a company have three main sectors: commercial, residential and hospitality. I'm looking after most of the hospitality projects, so hopefully can bring some hospitality discussion into today's forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Geoff. And finally, Pascal, welcome to you.
Afternoon, George and everyone that's tuning in. Pascal Wensink, I'm a design director at EPR Architects. As Geoff has mentioned, those three sectors that we cover has also allowed us to kind of branch into the sort of the master planning and regeneration projects, which actually similar to the one that George illustrated a moment ago, larger scale developments with multiple buildings, with multiple occupants and multiple uses.
Thanks, Pascal. Okay, so let's start. I'm just going to stop my screen share. Okay, so let's start by talking about definitions. Pascal, let's stick with you for a minute. Did you think that the definition that I showed there is still relevant today? And if not, how do you think, how would your definition of a mixed-use project have changed from that?
No, I do think that there's a lot of the elements that you kind of illustrated there do stand. I do think that the idea of a mixed use where you have a main use and then maybe just a small amount of a kind of a convenience store or something on the corner is not really mixed use. A mixed use scheme is really about bringing multiple uses which attract different people throughout the day, and you want that space or that building to kind of have a longer lifespan than the sort of like everyone turning up at one point. So that kind of not only, and then there's the crossover of different uses, so you get kind of a much more of an interesting mix of people at certain times, but actually there may be a concentration of one type of people in a morning or an afternoon or an evening, and even through into the night. So
okay, thanks, Pascal. Yolande, what did you think of that definition, and what's the latest academic thinking, if there's anything that's updated from that?
I think, to be perfectly honest, the definition's madly out of date, and I don't talk so much now about mixed use as multi-use, and I think increasingly we're even talking about co-use. I think for a whole set of different reasons, the old sort of asset classes, the idea of what a building's use is changing, and we've seen that obviously accelerated by COVID. But I think increasingly we're going to have to focus on what human beings are doing in buildings and not what a kind of late 20th century definition of a particular economic use is. And what I'm finding across the globe is that increasingly the owners of buildings are having to repurpose them as old tenants become obsolete, and active management is needed to avoid depreciation. And as tenants and landlords become much sort of lighter, more agile, lighter on their feet, more agile in managing space and responding to demand for space, so that we're into long life loose fit type buildings that can be actively managed for a whole variety of activities. And I think that's what the future of mixed use looks like. It's got to be much more flexible, and I think it's still evolving.
And does that make new buildings, does it potentially give them a longer lifespan if they are more flexible, in that they can be more easily adapted to a range of tenants?
I think as we learn that increasingly environmental performance and social performance go hand in hand with economic performance, we're finding that we can't keep knocking buildings down and repurposing them or rebuilding them for another use, and we have to adapt. So part of the building, a part of real estate, is increasingly encompassing customer experience and active management of occupiers and occupier experience. So a building's much less about its original function and much more about how it can be managed. We've talked a lot about placemaking over recent years. I think increasingly the future's about placekeeping. Okay,
interesting, thank you. Harry, this idea of considering the building's users, putting them at the centre of thinking rather than just thinking about the bottom line and traditional definitions, is that something that you're seeing in schemes that you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd definitely echo what Yolande's saying there, really. I think the sort of social agenda and the community aspect is far more acute now, and very important to most developers, really, institutional or private. They know that they've got to make the development and the design succeed from the user perspective, and that also ties in very neatly with the concept of the 15-minute city, which is ever more, has much more resonance now given the pandemic. And the four principles around that, proximity, diversity, density, and ubiquity. And when you kind of drill into that a bit more detail, that's multiple and diverse tenures, both from the residential side of things and the commercial side of things. People are much happier if they can live near where they work, and if they've got an easy commute or even a walk or a cycle to where they work. And we're seeing that with the whole of co-working accommodation, co-living accommodation, and how those tenures are changing. And then also how social landlords are responding to this. You've got big registered providers and housing associations really leading the way on how community can be put together through social housing and private housing, and then the whole build to rent agenda as well. So I think all of that is converging to change the way in which places are put together and how people are going to respond to them in how they live there and work there. And community and the social aspect, I think, is more and more important. You can no longer, and I think actually private developers or residential developers have learned quite a lot from members clubs and hotels and the hospitality sector, where it's no longer acceptable just to offer up, your basic box with no real amenity. Buyers and renters in apartments in central urban areas demand much more considered and curated amenity, be that from the health perspective and the health club or on-site retail. So I do think the power is much more with the resident, really, and the end user.
Yeah, we've seen quite a few of the build-to-rent operators hiring people with a hospitality background. And we've also seen it in workspaces as well. So it's definitely blurring. The list of potential uses that I showed earlier on that slide didn't include co-living and co-working, because I don't think those were a defined thing when that list was created. So how has the introduction of those changed developers' mindsets, do you think?
Because I think people can see the possibility, length of stay actually has become a very critical part of the jigsaw right from the get-go, from the funding point of view. And I think everybody's alive to the fact that there is going to be a mix of uses, be that potentially co-living, longer-term stay, short-term stay, extended stay, anywhere in between. And we can see that certain typologies respond better in different environments. I mean, we were involved with the collective scheme down in Canary Wharf, and actually as a building, albeit that the company hasn't fared very well, the building itself was occupied quite well through the pandemic because people liked the fact that they had autonomy, basically. They had their little unit that they'd go away to, and it was clean and it was their own place and they could cook there, etc. But even before the pandemic, that building was very well occupied because it offered up everything from a one-night stay as a kind of hotel concept through to a whole year's stay. And that's 705 units at that site. So it's a pretty big scheme in its own right, albeit it's one building. It's pretty much a multi-use function there. And so I think that's extending through to larger scale developments where people are going to want mix of tenure and mix of stay, different lengths of stay. Yeah.
Geoff, did you want to pick up?
Yeah, I just think this is obviously a subject that is close to our heart at the moment. What's been really nice for me is to see this this whole evolvement. We've been sort of around for quite a long time as a practice, and I've been here quite a few years now, but about 25 years ago when we sort of entered the hospitality sector, it was very prescriptive. It was very sort of cookie cutter, very sort of brand led. And what's been really nice for us to see is how all of the sectors are beginning to merge, and where before we had very distinct teams, very speciality teams, as designers we're now working more closely together where we're getting mixed use within a building. So a lot of our office developers are now insisting upon a restaurant, a gym, a rooftop bar, just more well-being is considered as opposed to the 9-to-5 job. And obviously the pandemic has escalated all of that, but and we do a lot of co-living, we do a lot of co-working projects now, which again sort of 20 years ago was something that was, dare I say, unheard of. So it's been really interesting, the conversation so far, because we're now picking up that kind of whole design ethos that has differed from perhaps the slides that you presented, where, as you quite rightly say, there wasn't co-working mentioned. Even religion, we've got there's one of our projects, Harry and I are working together with Shiva, and we've got there's a church that's in need of restoration. So there's been a method where we can bring to the community a renovation of that church and make that part of the project as well. So it kind of the community benefits from a developer-led project. So there's other really interesting community-led items that are on the agenda now that weren't there before. So thank you.
Thanks, Geoff. I'm interested to figure out the process of how the various elements of a scheme are decided, who decides it, and what the process is. Pascal, if we can talk to you a minute about the Ram Quarter, which is an interesting scheme down in Wandsworth, the former Young's Brewery. How early did you become involved, and how much of the decision making in terms of the various elements had been made then, or were you in right from the start?
So thank you. Minerva was our original client who bought the Ram Brewery in 2006 when Young's relocated to Bedford. I think that a lot of the best examples of mixed-use developments, which are multi-buildings, actually have some degree of character that's retained from the original site. So rather fortunately with the Ram Brewery, it has both grade 2 and grade 2 star listed buildings on the site. But in addition to that, there's a natural feature, which is the River Wandle, which runs straight through the centre of the site. Now, as an old brewery, the whole site was an isolated industrial site, so the public had no access to to actually the heritage buildings or the river. In fact, most people in Wandsworth wouldn't even know that the River Wandle flowed through the centre of the site. So what we had was kind of a very early stage diagram, which showed if you strip everything that's irrelevant to to changing an industrial site into a new residential quarter, if you take all that away, what are you left with? And you're left with a kind of a natural feature, which is the river. And 3 elements of heritage assets, which could then be converted and create interesting uses. There was a desire from day one to maintain some form of brewing on the site, because at the time it was England's oldest continuous brewery, dated back to 1530. So there's brewing taking place on that site since 1530. So to lose that legacy just seemed insane, really. So there was a sort of a microbrewery that was set up on site, which brewed a firkin of beer a month, not for sale. It was drunk by all the people that kind of were involved in the project. And that continued all the way through until 2020, when the site opened and the craft brewery relocated. Sam Brooks now, which is, I think, London's oldest independent brewer, is now their permanent home. So they have the legacy of brewing on England's oldest continuous brewery. So that was a kind of a very strong characteristic. We knew that the site would also be a residential-led quarter. So obviously a large proportion of residential would go in there. But we had this kind of desire to create, open up the boundaries, create a lot of public realm, new through routes through the centre of the site, which reconnected Wandsworth. And I think beyond the kind of the residential, which is above ground floor, and beyond the heritage buildings, what we've instantly done is created a place that people would come through, go through, meander through, either stop and dwell for a while, or actually just get, it would be a faster, more convenient way for them to get somewhere. So the site became useful in a wider context rather than just being insular. Ground floor, it was all pedestrianised. I think we went from 2 access points to over 11 access points, new river bridges, rewilding the river as well. And a ground floor active plane of uses. Now, originally, so going back to 2013 when we got planning consent, that was going to be heavily retail, but obviously retail market has changed significantly as well. Mm-hmm. But we did, within our planning consent, get a flexibility to kind of change that retail over time to kind of respond to changing environment. And actually, there's now there's elements of workspace on the site. So actually, going back to my original point, that rather than it just being a retail space that just had people coming during a certain amount of during the daytime, there's kind of evening activities, bars, restaurants, there's daytime activities, which is workspace. And there's also elements of retail, food, beverage, which are now also supported by some nighttime activities like the 10-pin bowling and the brewery, which basically has brewery tours. I think there's a real mix of how all of those uses came about, and there's a client who had a very strong desire. There was some heritage aspects. That there was the master brewer was remained on site who continued brewing, and a very strong desire from the local authority to try and get a new centre, a new heart, a new residential district in Wandsworth. So working with them as well as the Environmental Agency and Historic England, I think if you kind of get the more input you get from, and then also, you know, public focus groups, the more input you get from that, the more you'll get out of it, as opposed to coming up with an answer and then expecting everyone to buy into that.
Mm-hmm. And am I right in thinking that the developer that delivered the scheme was Greenland, so that wasn't the original? Did it change hands in the process? So
it changed hands more than once. So Minerva bought the site. Minerva was then bought by Delancey, who are, you know, a major significant developer in London. And once we had planning consent, the site was then sold to Greenland, which is a Chinese state-owned development company, which is effectively their first development in the UK. And were they happy with the vision that had already been laid out, or did they want to make? There was elements of questioning why decisions were made, but they had a big desire to actually build. They have a desire to build quickly, effectively, and to unpick the planning There were queries about, could we change this, and could we change uses, could we change scale, could we change materials? And the explanation that our planning process is quite robust, and to do that would actually mean going back into planning, and it would delay the project. They evaluated and felt that they were happy in principle, and then proceeded with building exactly as we had gained planning consent for, at least for phase one. There's a subsequent phase as well.
Great stuff. Thanks, Pascal. We'll move on to planning in a minute, but we've got a question here for you, Geoff, about the project that you mentioned. Julia is asking, does the church renovation need to be delivered as part of the planning consent? Is that part of your S106 agreement?
Yeah, there was because we decided to link the hotel project in with the crypt of the church, which provides the co-working element. So there's co-working, the church, and a hotel. So that meant that we had to exchange lease agreements to then bring the church into the planning application. So there was a 106 commitment to therefore refurbish the church. So yes, it is tied into 106.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. Okay, let's talk about planning. Yolande, you used the term co-use instead of mixed use. Dare I say, at a time when planners are just getting their heads around mixed use. So are planning departments keeping up with development trends, and does it very much vary from one part of the country or from one country to the other? Are we looking at a very mixed picture?
Well, of course, the economy of place and the character of place changes enormously from one part of the country to the other, or across countries. But there seems to be a kind of something that a lot of people don't seem to have spotted, is that regardless of where you are in the world, whether you're in North America or Europe or Australasia, planning use classes are remarkably similar, whether they're called zones or planning use classes. The sort of asset classes that you saw listed in your definition are pretty much the same the world over. And we talk about local planning or regional planning, or certainly planning at a national scale, but the use classes that are adopted reflect global investment asset classes. They don't actually have much to do sometimes with what actually local people are doing, and what local people are doing are responding to economic conditions in their part of the world. They're increasingly being entrepreneurial. We're increasingly seeing digital technology adopted, and I think those asset classes, those investment asset classes, are becoming less and less relevant to local economies in the 21st century, where we are doing things differently, and COVID has accelerated that. And what I would advocate and suggest is that actually we need to really rapidly let go of those use classes, both to enable better planning, because what we're increasingly finding is that the economic results, or the economic returns to developers and investors from place-based investing, multi-use, sort of flexible, agile, multi-use places, is greater than single use. That it's a case that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That you may go to a place to shop, and you end up eating there and visiting the brewery and all the other things that are going on. So there tends to be a kind of multiplier effect of multiple uses, which do need to change over time and flex over time. And I think if we started to think about planning, and indeed place-based investment, more in terms of what human beings are doing there. Human beings use real estate, use built environment to live, work, play, stay, make, visit, trade, the list goes on. And I think if we start thinking around those sort of human activities rather than investment asset classes, arguably outdated investment asset classes, we do a lot better. in terms of thinking not only about planning and being able to plan better, but also being able to invest better and ultimately manage those assets better.
And you mentioned that this is potentially a worldwide phenomenon. We've got a question here from Lydia, who's saying, so far we've spoken mainly about UK experiences, but are these trends spreading around Europe? And do you have any specific experience about the Middle East? I mean, out there we're talking about some of the fastest moving and evolving urban environments around. Are these trends being echoed there?
For sure. I mean, you can find examples, some really good sort of mixed use examples throughout Europe, increasingly through North America, and Japan, Australasia. And I mean, that's because the underlying sort of investor, financial and economic trends are global. There are different interesting different sort of local characterful responses to those trends. The thing about the Middle East, urbanism in the Middle East and indeed in Asia has been very rapid, and the rapid response has been along the lines of what I would call a late 20th century global model. So what you tend to find in the Middle East is that new cities are being built, and in Asia, in single-use big box sort of environments that are associated with that late 20th century sort of what I would call lumpy investment for capital growth. Now, increasingly, investors are looking for long-term income streams. And I think you know, the revenue producing uses is an interesting phenomenon, because we're increasingly finding revenues been generated from multiple uses on complex sites, and much more efficiently than single big box uses. And I think one of the characteristics, I've looked at Dubai, for example. I think the whole city there has been planned around a highly segregated sort of media city, tech city. You're all separated out, all carefully zoned. And actually the most productive places are ones where everybody's working together and kind of cross-fertilizing each other's ideas. So you find the most productive cities in North America and Europe, for example, are those where the media people are talking to the artists who are talking to the tech people, and you get a mashup of the whole. So I think there's a real problem in the Middle East and Asia of the zoned city really not working in the same way and not being as productive, and ultimately therefore not producing the revenue that the investors want to see. And I think the great challenge for those sort of new cities is to almost retrofit a fine-grained urbanism, a loose fit, back onto them to try and mix things up. And that's where I go back to my point about placekeeping, the ongoing management. And we can learn a great deal from hospitality, you know, that is used to managing long stay, short stay, a multitude of customer types. You know, I think refocusing on the customer experience, the human experience in cities, is really important for those Middle Eastern and Asian cities to do.
Yeah, thank you, Yolande. Let's talk about revenue for the minute. Harry, the definition we saw kind of stressed that no one element of a scheme should dominate the others. Are developers now trying to plan schemes where each unit is self-sufficient in terms of its profitability, or do some carry the others, which are there for, you know, the wider benefit of the community rather than the bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, it's so specific to, you know, geographic location, really. I think generally, yes, that you've got to have a diverse number of uses, and any sponsor or investor is going to be looking to ensure that you know, you're spreading your risk across the whole site. You know, if we're talking large-scale developments, then these are generally funded by institutional investors, pension funds, etc. and they're going to ensure that it's recession proof as well as they can. But then the flip side to that, we're involved with a scheme in Soho. I sit on the board of Soho Housing Association, and we're doing the affordable element of the Alona Rose house redevelopment, which is on the old Foyles site. And there's a couple of 100,000 square foot of office there, because Soho Estates, that's the profit centre for them, is the office scheme. And given its location, they know that's going to be a profitable outcome. But given that, even having said that, their attention to the public realm and the retail at the ground floor is exceptional. And they're encouraging some very small scale operators there, hospitality led and pure retail. And then also the affordable element that's going in there is the only residential that's going in there. And any one of us, I think, would be very happy to have one of those 2-bedroom apartments in that scheme. They're absolutely beautiful. They've got double height spaces. They're kind of almost penthouse units. It's incredible. But, Soho Estates, I think, are a very, very intelligent operator and very intelligent developer, and know that the quality of that scheme is going to, give it its value over a long term, and that's going to be a very, very attractive investment to somebody that scale of office use. But then all the other mixed uses in there are going to have to stand up on their own right as well. So I think generally, yes, you've got to look for a diverse number of uses, and they've got to stand up on their own. And they're going to have to potentially go through different economic cycles, and some are going to be more attractive than others at different times. Who knew that over the last year and a half, hotel investments would not be very attractive in the last year and a half, but I think that's a very short blip. Well, I know it is, because you look at the amount of money that's going into hospitality-led schemes now, and we're not even out of the pandemic. So that's a very short cycle. But then, the developers around Canary Wharf, we're looking at potentially 1 or 2 recessions during the lifespan of the development down there.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Pascal, Harry mentioned public realm there. The slide that we looked at earlier of the Leeds scheme had 55% of the total area of the scheme as public realm. Obviously, it depends where you are and what your land costs are, whether you can do that. But as a general rule, are we seeing more and better public realm in development now than we used to?
I think definitely. I think we're definitely seeing, even for single-use buildings, the space around the buildings has become increasingly important. And I don't necessarily think it's quantity, though. It's quality, and maybe something, kind of echoing what Yolande was saying about how places are kept. So if you have a large amount of public realm and it has no real use, or it's not curated, it just becomes a big space, which is no one feels particularly comfortable in it. So there's got to be the scale of the space associated with the scale of the buildings. There should also be some form of easily identifiable uses in its play space for children of a certain age, or its flexible space that's curated well and has different activities, whether it be markets, whether it be events, whether it be for either organised events or informal events even. So I think that's the real key. It's not so much put as much public realm in as possible. It's just making sure that public realm is of good quality and there is a kind of identifiable use for that space.
Yeah. Yolande, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to build on that and say we've got, I think the way we think about public realm has to be less of something that the planners are insisting on, a kind of Section 106 sort of approach, and much more thought of as integral to the value of the development. And I've carried out studies which have demonstrated that high quality, and I endorse what Pascal was saying there, high quality open space does add value to real estate. And I suppose I'd like to sort of make a plea that we stop thinking in terms of the spaces between buildings, which I think is something that architects say, as geographers call them streets. And I think we don't consider streets, that is those routes that human beings take to get from where they are to where they want to be, rather than the sort of streets or roads that take traffic. But if we start thinking of streets as the human realm, I think we have to increasingly think of them as public realm and open space, and start. If we start thinking about the quality of experience and indeed the environmental quality of the humble street, then we can enhance value a great deal. So, street trees, that, thinking about the walking and cycling experience before we think about the movement of traffic, keeping those road traffic engineers in check can have an amazing impact on value, social value, environmental value, and consequently economic value as well.
Yeah, thanks, Yolande. Harry, I can see your hand is raised there.
Sorry, I was just actually, I'd noticed Mike Stapley's question in the Q&A box, but which I was very interested in. So, but whenever you're ready to take that.
Yeah, let's go for it. I shall read it. Oh, no, yeah. So Mike Stapley has said, are local authority planning departments seeing the vision and behind the growth of multi-use developments? And Mike is coming at it from a service department perspective, where they have, for example, had a generally negative stance towards shorter stays under 3 months for residential property.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and in my experience, yes, local authorities are getting behind it for sure. We've just been involved in a scheme in Luton for about 1,200 homes. It's a big site, sort of 30 odd acres, and we went through the process under a PPA, which is Planning Performance Agreement, which I think is one of the biggest step changes in local authority approach to this kind of scheme, where you enter into an agreement with the local authority, you pay them a fee, and they have a performance and a programme and milestones along there. So the developer has a very open picture as to what is going to be achieved along the way. There's continual review with the local authority's design review panel. So there's no surprises, and you're building up the scheme with the local authority. And I think it's the mature way to go. And so, as you get along, they start embracing certain uses and other uses. But then also, again, going back to the scheme down in Canary Wharf for the collective, at that time, there still isn't really a co-living use class, but the GLA are looking to adopt it. And we were lobbying with the collective to Sadiq Khan to produce a use class in London. And, we've looked at co-living schemes in Manchester and Liverpool, and all of those local authorities are aware of those uses. And I think they are up to speed now on the mixed tenure and the mixed length of stay that is coming in, and they're aware that people want to live in a different way, that you're not getting the longevity of people staying in one spot anymore, and people like the flexibility. And I think local authorities generally in larger urban areas are reflecting that.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Geoff, let's move on and talk about sustainability. What are the strengths of mixed-use development when it comes to environmental performance, and what are the weaknesses?
I was just going to draw on some of the, we mentioned the reuse of buildings and reinvigorating existing buildings. So we're fortunate enough to be working on quite a few listed buildings which are conversions. So one of the kind of plus points there is that from just picking up on Yolanda's comments about people, sort of the human reaction, the emotion, the memorable event that people have. I think working within beautiful listed buildings in itself is a wonderful backdrop to creating a project, because it in turn means that people have that sort of memorable experience. It also means that we're reusing the stock that already exists within our country, which means obviously less environmental concerns with regard to demolishing buildings and reconstructing the buildings. The challenge is always really just trying to convince the guests that you know, opening a window rather than switching on a fan cool unit is acceptable. So we get quite a few projects where we have very strong sustainable credential clients that want to push the boundaries and have passive ventilation, reuse of existing buildings, and also just don't change the plans too much. So actually work within the fabric of the building. So we have different clients with different demands. As a practice, we've won a few. I think we won a couple last week, Pascal, as sustainability awards. So we as a practice are big ambassadors for you know, sort of BREEAM and sustainable projects. But I just wanted to draw on some of the existing buildings that we convert, because I think that's a wonderful way of ticking quite a few boxes and also creating a memorable event for those that use the building. Thanks,
Geoff. Sorry if I was looking a little bit distracted there. I have got my window open and an enormous bumblebee is flying around my office.
It's probably bringing free honey to you as well. So there's probably a
global warming. The bees are still going around.
It's crazy. Yolande, can you talk us about sustainability trends and what's driving them? Obviously, there's a huge emphasis among investors now on the whole ESG agenda. Is that filtering down to how mixed-use developments are designed and operated?
I can't think of a client that hasn't mentioned ESG in some shape or form. It really is massively filtering down, and of course, you know, reflecting the comments just made, there's nothing less sustainable than demolishing a building. So there's nothing less sustainable than obsolescence, which is why we're increasingly finding that binding together social sustainability with environmental sustainability is as it were inevitable. Yeah, the focus is very much on the way it's. I think it's all part of this multi-use, co-use conversation that whether we're talking about the future of high streets, the future of investing, the future of returns, the shift from an emphasis on investing for the baby boomers for capital growth has now turned into actually paying the baby boomers pensions. So the necessity to generate long-term robust income streams means that there's inevitably a kind of concern about the sustainability of those income streams. So there's sustainability, economic sustainability is becoming a different thing. And I think increasingly they're bound together and are going to be reflected in the built environment. And I think increasingly, the more I look at it, the more I think when it comes to the built environment, the form of the built environment and the way we design it, doesn't follow function as people think it does. It actually follows finance, and this changing nature of finance. Its link to social and environmental sustainability is in the process right now of changing our built forms, and the way we do architecture, the way we design places, and the way we design the business models around those places is increasingly following this changed emphasis, this trend towards sustainability and long-termism. I mean, one thing that low interest rates do, and they're low globally compared to the late 20th century, they're going to remain low. You know, low interest rates mean long payback periods. So a 2% interest rate environment is effectively a 50-year payback environment, whereas a 10% interest rate environment is a 10-year payback environment. So I think inherently these low interest rate, low inflation sort of environments across the world are inherently a long-term environment, and investment terms, return, you know, the time horizon we're looking at now is inherently longer than it used to be in the late 20th century. Yeah, I think we have to look at sustainability in that context and understand that we're actually happily we're working with a kind of financial and business environment that not just because of UN directives, but because of imperatives of making returns, and the type of returns they need to make are increasingly looking towards multi-use, flexible, sort of whole place-based investments. And we, as in the real estate, whether we're designing or whatever we're doing in real estate, have to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you, Yolande. Pascal, we've established that repurposing buildings is generally more sustainable than new builds. How is the advancement of technology and new building materials and so on, is it becoming easier to retrofit old buildings to significantly improve their environmental performance?
I think the truth is it's always a challenge. So historic buildings come in all shapes and forms. If you can go down to sort of like the kind of, I don't know, Victorian terraced housing, how would you make those more sustainable? What would that look like? You effectively, to try and bring up to a standard of sort of a passive house standard, you'd be adding on extra space to the outside of the building or the inside. If you put it on the inside of the building, every household will lose space. If you put it on the outside, it changes what everything looks like. So I think it is much more of a challenge. I think the biggest thing with the listed buildings is to get agreement with Historic England that the building, for it to survive, it needs to adapt. And for it to adapt, there has to be, you can't keep everything in aspic. You need to kind of allow some changes, and that will allow that building to be transformed and hopefully enjoyed, as Geoff said, hopefully enjoyed. If it gets transformed into something that's access to the public, then the public get access to it and they enjoy it. But the actual sustainable credentials of a historic building, you can always improve them, but it's very unlikely you'll get them up to modern day standards. So you're accepting a lesser standard for the benefits of not destroying, not retaining a smaller carbon footprint through not demolition and rebuilding, but the actual building will have a lower sustainable credentials than a new building.
Okay, and what role does technology play when it comes to building management and being energy efficient? I think
that's, and again, comes back to an element of what Yolande was saying. It's like place keeping or building keeping, building maintenance. I think you can put all the kind of technology you want into a building, but if the building is not being managed properly, for instance, lights being left on, but if we can then get to either light sensors or a building management system that is more intelligent, or just the actual building managers understanding the systems, making sure that they're not being used. You're not pumping out heat and opening a window just to kind of cool the space down. So technology, I think, definitely will be a positive way of improving sustainable credentials of historic buildings as well as new buildings.
Thanks, Pascal. Okay, we're coming to the end of our hour, so I'm now going to ask you each in turn, what are your favourite and your most disliked mixed-use developments? And Geoff, I'm going to start with you.
Apologies, just now I just turned off my mute button. I'm biased, so we love the Ram Brewery. We think that it encompasses historic restoration, and it's a completely changed placemaking project. So we're quite biased because it's our project, but that is one of my favourites because it's just something that we're proud of. So I'd like to sort of throw that into the arena. I know there are some worldwide better projects, but because we're so sort of passionate about what we do, we've been sort of part of that journey, so we feel emotionally connected to that project.
Okay, and what about one that you really don't like?
We did a really a huge development in Cuba, which we did a master plan for, and it was very commercially led. So it kind of lost its way a little bit. So only because I'm familiar with the detail and the reasoning behind the development. I would say that was probably one of my worst experiences of a huge mixed development. It was much bigger than RAM, but it was just it just had the wrong morals sitting behind it.
Interesting. I wasn't expecting that. Thank you, Geoff. That was Yolande, favourite and least favourite.
Well, I suppose, yeah, I'm going to stick my neck out. I'm going to say that one of my favourites is Poundbury in Dorset, and if you don't like pastiche twee architecture, and I have some sympathy with that, just redraw it in your mind with a sort of modernist facade, as it were, or whatever floats your boat. The reason I like Poundbury is because it feels like it's been there forever. It's got for a new bit, or yeah, let's call it a new build development. It has an incredible variety of tenures, uses, and a genuine sort of economic raison d'etre that's grown out of the way it's been built. So what's important about Poundbury, I think, is the geography, if you like. That's the streetscape and the way it's been ongoingly managed for industrial use, work creating uses, as well as just the residential element. So it has as it were, an economic life that makes it sustainable and robust as a piece of urbanism. And just leave your feelings about the aesthetics to one side if you have to. I think the worst mixed use is almost invariably where it's mixed use in name only, where there isn't that integration of the environmental, the social, and the economic, where a place isn't mixed use just because you put one big box of something that's different to another big box of something else next to each other. And I suppose my least favorite bit of urbanism is the 9Elm, and I think it's still a sort of case in progress, but the 9Elms development of London, I think, is a case of those sort of big box uses all placed next to each other and not necessarily working at a human street level.
I'm with you on both of those. I like Poundbury more the older I get, which I don't know what that says about my stage of life.
I'm glad we didn't work on 9Elms, Pascal.
Harry, over to you.
Well, I think my favourite is there's a place called the Municipal project for intergenerational housing in Alicante. It's fantastic. It's I think 65% over 65s and 35% under 35s, and it's subsidised housing and retail. And a condition of living there, if you're a younger person, you have to effectively adopt 3 of the older people, and it's fantastically successful. People love living there. They love the community aspect and the social aspect of it. So I think that's hugely successful. My worst, and this is a bit off message, but I just wanted to get a dig in for this, or a shout out for this. There's an article called The Golf Belt by Russell Curtis, and I'd urge you all to read it. And there's 43 municipal owned golf clubs in London, and they cover the equivalent area of Hammersmith and Fulham Council, but are used by about 300 people a week. And I think this article by Russell Curtis is amazing in the depth he goes into about the frequency and the little use these fantastic green spaces come under. And they're publicly owned spaces in the middle of metropolitan areas, but they're just not getting used by the general public, and they're beautiful green lungs in the middle of London. And so if they were developed in a better way, not built over, but developed in a better way, they would throw it open for much more general public use. So that would be my worst case, I think.
Yeah, the Mark Twain school of urbanism. He said golf is a good walk ruined, I think.
Yes, well, Russell Curtis mentions that in the article. It's really worth looking at.
Pascal, finally over to you, please.
Yeah, so Geoff stole mine, really. I put a lot of time and effort into Round Brewery, so it's something particularly close to my heart. But actually, I went to see a scheme this year up in Hull, which is the old fruit market in Hull. And it's a great piece of mixed use. It was abandoned land by the marina, and the developers have kept a lot of the old buildings. They've kept some of the old businesses, and then supplemented that with some relatively low scale housing. And I think it's that kind of contextual mixed use, which we certainly tried to do it at the Round Brewery. I think we've succeeded, but that's the kind of schemes that I like. So they're truly mixed use. They're available to the wider public as well as a community that live there or work there. And they respond to their context in some way, some kind of, whether it's historic buildings listed or just old buildings that have been retained. In terms of least favourite, I'm not going to point the finger at any one particular building, but I think it's the kind of the pseudo mixed use buildings which basically have multiple uses in them, but all those uses are only for either the occupants of the building. So there's a real risk with some of the co-working and the co-living schemes that actually they have restaurants, they have sports facilities, have different uses, but it's just keeping the people in those buildings, and it's not engaging with the kind of the wider community.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you, Pascal, and thank you all for what's been a great session. I'm just going to share my screen and run through a couple of slides very quickly. So our next webinar, and the final one of the year, is a week today, and I will be talking about some trends in urban living that I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it in 2022. You can see the link to register for that in the chat. You can also, I should have mentioned earlier, you can also see the LinkedIn profiles for our panelists if you'd like to carry on the conversation with them. That's also in the chat. If you'd like to get involved in any of our events or our webinars as a participant or as a sponsor, please do drop us a line. You can see my colleague Katie's details on the screen there, and they are also in the chat. Thanks for watching. Thanks ever so much to Yolande, to Harry, to Geoff, and to Pascal for their insights. I think it's been a great session. If you are on any of the social channels there, give us a follow and get involved. And finally, we are just going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes, so you can take down some of the information that is in the chat. Other than that, thanks very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks, everyone.